This response session is a little bit different from the previous ones because we have merged the response and the panel due to that it's just a small session. So I will just mention a few reflections and then we can open up for the discussion. But I think this the analogy between individual humans in a context with many other humans interacting and that of individual neurons interacting with many other neurons. And when we do experiments, we can sort of take the average response and see what happens. For example, when we make a voting poll for which party will win in the next election, we get rather good, normally, not always, but rather good predictions about that. I wonder if we could learn anything more about this analogy. Is it just an analogy, or is there something deeper in terms of how neurons interact and how humans interact? And when we, that's one point. Another is when we talk about environment in natural science, or in this context with neuroscience and free will, for example, we often think of the environment in general, but not really focusing so much on other humans in the environment. So, for example, in experiments where you have an experimenter and a subject, the role of the experimenter is not really given, or it's to some extent neglected, how that person who is running the experiment may affect or influence the response of the subjects. And I think that would be interesting to discuss in this context, especially if some people have raised the issue here that people have been given, for example, the objective to push a button at a certain time interval, and people feel that they should do that to make the experimenter happier in some sense, or to follow the instructions. And depending on what how the experimenter is doing, I think it's not negligible, and how that person is interacting with his or her subjects. So that's one thing. We also talked about reflective consciousness, and that free will presupposes reflectivity. And that is then, the question is what we mean again by free will. And we have been discussing free will in some sense at the level of fruit flies or amphibia and other animals which may not reflect so much, but still may show some sign of what we could call free will. So I would like to hear your thoughts about that. And then again, Anna actually raised the question I had with when you said that collective consciousness precedes individual consciousness. So I would like to have a little bit more discussion on that if we can. I was thinking of social animals, for example. Would they have a very different consciousness than solitary animals? And people living in solitude, is that their consciousness very different from people living in a very rich social context? And how can we measure that, or how can we see that? And to what extent would their possibility to exert or practice their free will be different, if at all, in such context, if you are living in social context, or if you are living very much by yourself alone? So those were my reflections, and I don't know if you want to respond to that immediately.
Just a few points. on a very general level, I think someone pointed out that in studies, neuroscience, in the neuroscience context, it made a difference if the choice was meaningful or not. And my reaction is that we are paying too little attention to all the different dimensions that are active in a situation when human action and possibly human free will is taking place. And even in the small situation, as you point to, Hans, the role of the investigator in the particular experiment. We have learned from other parts of science that it's very difficult to distinguish between the result and the impact the investigator has. And sometimes I feel that when we look at the single brain, we tend to exclude that dimension from the study. I have a problem, perhaps more than Tom, with the conception of collective consciousness. And I think that it might be that I mean the same when I talk about collective meaning systems. Because we wouldn't be able to create any meaning of our own if we were not connected to meaning systems created within the community. And in that sense, that is sort of a consciousness-like dimension. But it's not consciousness in the same way as we mean when we talk about consciousness in a single individual.
I'm not sure where to begin, but I think your first question, Hans, about neuron interaction as opposed to interaction among persons. I think in terms of methods, I think we are developing common methods, for instance, simulation and so on. So I think we learn from one another. There was a time when social science very much influenced natural science, more than natural science influenced social science. But for a couple of hundred years it's been different. I was trained in physics. I come to sociology because many of my professors at Stanford were opposed to nuclear weapons and opposed to nuclear testing and so on and so forth. And Stanford was very early in putting natural scientists and social scientists together to do something about it. And in fact, they contributed to the first test ban treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union, because they developed the method of distinguishing between earthquakes and nuclear tests. Otherwise, the US had always insisted on inspection, going to the place and seeing. Well, Hans has a very good point about the experimenter. Of course, this is sort of bread and butter sociology. How do you as an interviewer or you as an observer affect the process going on? And of course you do. There's no question. And it relates to the sort of thing that Walter Buckley and I did years ago. We wrote a paper on the prisoners dilemma game as a three-person game, because the district attorney plays a role in structuring the game and in communicating about the game. And you get a different vision or a different model of the process if you think of it in those terms. Free will, I mean, that's what our conference is very much about, and I think we will continue the discussions. I do say that free will is institutionalized, either in terms of those words or other words, in our language, and even in our laws. And so that's why we keep coming back to questions like moral responsibility, etc., etc. I mean, it's we can call it something else. It happens to be we have 2,000 years or so of the use of the free will terminology. I thought there was also a very interesting question here about social animals and us. I think we're learning more and more about social animals. They're very social, and they learn to make distinctions. They are communicating with one another. It's just they're not communicating with language. We're having this discussion with language. We can then go to another level and reflect on our discussions. Are they been fruitful? Are we understanding one another? I wrote what I did in my letter to you because if you're looking at what I'm saying in terms of the frameworks that many of you are using, you're not going to understand much of this at all, except that you have been a participant in many of these things since you were a child. You have this in you. Every human being is a sociologist. Is there a difference? Yeah, if there's a difference between the hermit, I would say I have practiced being a hermit. When you come back, I did it because we had a cottage on Gotland, and I would get a lot written. I mean, I produced a book a year by being on Gotland for summer for a number of years. When I would come, and I had to, at least every couple of weeks, I had to go to town. And I was not able to behave properly. I was misunderstanding what people said. I was saying, not saying thank you or, the usual civilities. And I think a hermit loses the capability of all those habits that we practice daily. And some people are very good at practicing them, and they're very important for our social life. We should be teaching our children those practices so they know how. I tried to teach my son here in Sweden. In England, we go there, you have to say thank you. You have to say please. We got on the boat in Gothenburg, and my son said, I want a hamburger. Waiter said, you should say please. So my message got across. He's a very polite Swedish citizen today.
Any comments from the audience? I'll make a final observation then, unless I see a hand. I was very interested by your comment on two things you said. You analogize the interaction between neurons to the interaction between human beings. And I think Tom just said, or maybe it was Al, I'm not sure, we can use certain methods of simulation to study both sets of interactions. But it seems to me the fact that we can use, in the abstract sense, certain methods of study to look at two different kinds of systems doesn't mean that two different kinds of systems are precisely analogous. And so I think of the interaction between neurons, and here I'm begging the question against a certain radically reductionist view. I think of the interaction between neurons as purely mechanistic. I think of the interaction between human beings as only very partially mechanistic and very much agentic. And it seems to me those are very, very different things. And I also think, now to come back to Hans's comment, do fruit flies have freedom? Well, if you define freedom in a certain sense of notions of pure mechanical constraint, well, they may have more or less than an amoeba. But that to me is not very relevant to what I take it to be the fundamental question in this conference, which is what does freedom mean, or free will, for human interaction and human society? And I think that's a very, very different kind of meaning of freedom than the kind of meaning you would put to, say, compare a fruit fly to an amoeba. But that's a comment. Let's have lunch.